Colorado Territory, 1879. Daniel Whitcomb had buried a wife, raised a daughter mostly alone, and gotten into the bad habit of saying things before he thought them through. That habit was about to cost him more than he knew. He was 34 years old, ran 400 head of cattle on land his father had claimed 20 years back, and had spent the 5 years since his wife Eleanor passed doing exactly two things well: raising his daughter Sarah and avoiding any conversation that might lead a person to think he was looking for a second wife. He wasn't looking. That's what he told anybody fool enough to ask. Margaret Sullivan was 28 years old, unmarried, and ran the only blacksmith forge in Larkin Creek since her father's heart gave out 2 winters back. She'd taken over the trade the way she did most things, without asking permission, and without much patience for anybody who thought a woman had no business at an anvil. The town had opinions about that. Plenty of them. 28 and unmarried was considered, in most circles, a condition requiring explanation, if not outright pity. Maggie had neither the patience nor the interest to offer either. "She'll shoe your horse faster and cheaper than any man in the territory," was how most folks in Larkin Creek put it. "And she'll tell you exactly what she thinks of your opinion on the matter too." Daniel had known Maggie the better part of 10 years, ever since her father first shod his father's horses, and he counted her among the handful of people in Larkin Creek he genuinely enjoyed talking to. That was the whole of it, as far as he'd ever let himself examine the matter. Until the morning his gelding threw a shoe 2 miles out from the forge, and he found himself waiting the better part of an hour in Maggie Sullivan's shop, watching her work with a competence that made most of the men in town look clumsy by comparison, and thinking thoughts he had no business thinking about a woman he'd always considered simply a friend. That was the morning the trouble started, though neither one of them had the sense yet to call it trouble. Larkin Creek sat 40 miles east of the mountains proper, a town of maybe 300 souls built around a creek that ran fast in spring and thin in August, and it had exactly 1 blacksmith, 1 mercantile, 1 small church, and enough gossip to make up for the lack of anything else worth talking about. Daniel had lived there his whole life. Maggie had too, save for 2 years her father sent her to a cousin in St. Louis to learn proper letters and manners, both of which she'd come home declaring mostly useless for a woman who intended to spend her days at an anvil, regardless of what anybody thought proper. Daniel's ranch sat 6 miles north of town, a modest spread by the standards of the bigger outfits further west, but honest land, paid for mostly, with a herd that had weathered 2 hard winters better than most of his neighbors had. He'd married Eleanor at 23, buried her at 29, and spent the 5 years since telling himself a man with a 9-year-old daughter and a ranch to run had no business thinking past the next season, let alone thinking about whether he was lonely. "You're limping that horse in like he stepped on a rattler," Maggie said, not looking up from the forge as Daniel led his gelding through the wide barn doors. "What'd you do to him?" "Didn't do a thing. Shoe came loose on the north road. Shoe came loose because somebody didn't check it before a 2-hour ride, is my guess. Somebody had a fence needed mending before sunup and didn't think to check." She looked up at that, wiping soot off her hands with a rag that had seen better days, and gave him the particular look she reserved for men who thought excuses counted as explanations. "Sit," she said, nodding toward a bench along the wall. "This'll take a spell." He sat, watched her work, the sure, practiced motion of her hammer, the way she talked to the horse low and steady the whole while, the same way she might have talked to a nervous child. "You're good at that," he said, meaning it plainer than he usually let himself mean things. "Good at shoeing a horse. Low bar, Daniel, wasn't a low bar where I was raised." "Where were you raised, exactly?" "Because near as I recall, it was about 11 miles from here, same as me." He laughed at that. She had a way of cutting a compliment down to size before it could get comfortable, always had, and something about the ease of it, the 10 years of easy back and forth between them, struck him different that particular morning than it ever had before. He didn't say anything more about it. Just watched her finish the shoe, paid her the 30 cents she was owed, and rode home, turning the whole hour over in his mind the entire way, wondering why an hour he'd spent 100 times before suddenly felt like it meant something. That was the whole first contact worth mentioning. No fireworks. Just a loose shoe, and a man noticing something he'd been standing next to for 10 years without ever quite seeing. The kindnesses started small, same as they always do. Daniel's daughter Sarah was 9 years old, sharp as a tack, and had taken a particular liking to Maggie's forge ever since her mother passed. On account of Maggie being the only woman in Larkin Creek who let her get close enough to the fire to actually watch the iron glow. So Daniel started finding reasons to ride into town on days he knew Sarah would tag along, and Maggie started finding reasons to let the girl linger past when the work was done, teaching her small things: how to tell irons ready by its color, how to hold a hammer so it didn't blister your palm. "You don't have to keep her occupied like that," Daniel said one such afternoon, watching Sarah practice striking a cold piece of scrap iron under Maggie's careful supervision. "Not keeping her occupied. Teaching her a trade, same as my father taught me. World's got room for more women who know how to make something with their hands instead of just mending somebody else's shirt." Sarah's mother would have liked that, I think. I didn't know her well, but anybody who raised a girl this curious must have been worth knowing. Daniel didn't have an answer for that right away. Nobody in 5 years had spoken Eleanor's name so plain and easy, without the careful pity most folks layered over it. The second gesture came from Daniel, though he'd have called it nothing much if pressed. Maggie's forge roof had been leaking since the spring rains, a problem she'd been patching with tar and stubbornness, rather than admitting she needed help fixing it proper. Daniel noticed it one afternoon picking Sarah up, noticed the bucket catching drips in the corner, and said nothing about it that day. But the following Saturday, he showed up with lumber and shingles loaded in his wagon, and Silas, no, not Silas, a different hand this time, a boy named Wyatt who worked Daniel's ranch, and the two of them spent the better part of a day up on that roof without so much as asking Maggie's permission first. "I didn't ask for this," she said, standing in the yard with her arms crossed, watching them work. "Didn't ask you to. Man doesn't need permission to fix a roof that's about to fix him a lawsuit when the whole thing caves in on a customer's head. That's a poor excuse for meddling, Daniel Whitcomb. Best excuse I've got. You want us to stop halfway through?" She didn't answer that, mostly because the answer was plainly no, and both of them knew it. She brought them coffee at noon instead, and said nothing further on the matter, which from Maggie Sullivan was as close to a thank you as a man was like to get. The third gesture belonged to both of them, in a manner of speaking. Old Ezekiel Barnes, who ran the Larkin Creek Mercantile, and had done so since before either Daniel or Maggie were born, fell ill that autumn, bad enough that his shop sat closed 3 straight weeks, and bad enough that half the town found themselves short on supplies they'd normally have bought without a second thought. Maggie organized it without being asked twice. Went round to every household with any means to spare, and put together a fund to cover Ezekiel's doctor bills. And Daniel matched whatever she raised dollar for dollar out of his own pocket, without a word of complaint, though it came to $11.40 by the time all was said and done. More than a small sum for a rancher still paying off a herd he'd expanded 3 years back. "You didn't have to match it," Maggie told him, once the fund had been delivered and Ezekiel was well on the mend. "Didn't have to. Wanted to. You raised the money on your own 2 feet, asking half this town for favors they didn't owe you. Man ought to match effort like that when he sees it. Most men around here wouldn't have noticed the effort at all. Most men around here aren't paying near the attention to you I apparently am," he said, and then looked immediately like he wished he could take the words back out of the air. Maggie didn't say anything to that, but she smiled, small and quick, before turning back to her work, and Daniel rode home that evening, feeling like he'd said more true than he'd meant to. The fourth gesture, small as it was, came from Maggie again, though it took Daniel weeks to understand the full weight of it. Sarah had taken sick that November with a fever that frightened Daniel considerably more than he let on, being a man used to hiding his fear behind steady hands and quiet work. Maggie heard of it through Wyatt, who'd ridden into town for the doctor, and closed her forge for 2 full days without a word to a single customer, riding out to the Whitcomb ranch instead, to sit with Sarah through the worst of the fever. She brought her own remedies, a tea her mother had taught her, willow bark and honey, and a cool cloth she changed every hour through 2 long nights, spelling Daniel when his own eyes grew too heavy to keep watch any longer. "You didn't have to close the forge for this," Daniel said the second night, finding her still awake at Sarah's bedside near 3 in the morning. "Forge can wait. Little girl running a fever that high can't. Lost customers 2 days running on my account. Lost customers is a poor trade against a child's life, Daniel. I'd make that trade every single time, and you'd be a fool to think otherwise." Sarah's fever broke the following morning, and though Maggie never once mentioned the 2 days' lost income again, Daniel noticed she came up short on her own supplies that winter, and quietly arranged for a shipment of coal and iron ore to arrive at her forge before Christmas. Paid in full, no note attached, though she knew well enough who'd sent it. Now, before we go further, I want to pause and thank every one of you listening tonight. I've heard from folks as far off as New Zealand and Germany, all tuning into these old stories, and it never stops amazing me how far a simple tale can travel. Now, back to Daniel and Maggie. The fourth gesture came at Christmas. Small as a button but heavy as anything either of them had given the other all year. Maggie had noticed, months back, that Daniel still wore his late wife's wedding ring on a leather cord around his neck, tucked under his shirt where most folks wouldn't see it, and she'd never once mentioned it, respecting the private grief of a thing that wasn't hers to comment on. But that Christmas, she gave him a small forged iron hook, plain and unremarkable to anybody who didn't know the story behind it, meant to hang just inside his bedroom door. "For the ring," she said, when he looked at it puzzled. "Not asking you to take it off, or forget her, or any such thing. Just thought maybe it was time it had a place to rest, that wasn't against your skin every hour of every day. A man can carry grief without wearing it round his neck like a chain, Daniel. There's a difference between remembering somebody and never once setting the weight of it down." He didn't say anything for a long moment, turning the little hook over in his rough hands. "That's about the kindest thing anybody's said to me in 5 years, he said finally. "Wasn't trying to be kind, was trying to be honest. Sometimes those look the same from the outside." He hung that hook the very next morning, and though he still wore the ring some days, more days than not, he found he didn't need to wear it every day anymore, and that alone felt like a door opening somewhere he hadn't known was shut. It was Sarah, 9 years old, and entirely without a filter for such things, who said the plain truth neither adult had managed. She'd taken to riding into town with her father most Saturdays specifically to see Maggie, and one such Saturday, sitting on the bench in the forge, waiting for her father to finish loading supplies, she looked up at Maggie with the particular directness only a child possesses and said, "Are you going to marry my papa?" Maggie nearly dropped the tongs she was holding. "What makes you ask a thing like that, Sarah?" "Because you look at him like Aunt Ruth looks at Uncle Frank. All soft, like you're trying not to smile too big. And Papa's the same way when he talks about you at supper, except he pretends he's talking about the horse the whole time." "I do not talk about the horse the whole time," Daniel said, appearing in the doorway just in time to hear the last of it, red creeping up from his collar. "You talked about Miss Sullivan's forge for 11 whole minutes last Tuesday, Papa." I counted. Neither adult had a ready answer for that. Maggie busied herself with the tongs. Daniel busied himself loading a sack of feed. He didn't strictly need to load that particular moment. But something had been said out loud, that both of them had been dancing carefully around for the better part of 6 months, and neither one of them managed to unhear it. The joke that started the whole trouble came on an ordinary Tuesday in February, and Daniel would spend a good long while afterward, wishing he'd thought a moment longer before he said it. He'd been teasing Maggie about a suitor she'd politely turned away the week before. A cattle buyer from Denver, respectable enough, who'd made his interest plain and been just as plainly declined. At this rate, Daniel said, meaning it light, meaning it as the kind of joke two old friends traded easy. You'll never get married, Maggie Sullivan. He expected a sharp retort. Expected her to cut the comment down to size the way she always did. Instead, she went quiet a moment, setting down the horseshoe she'd been shaping, and looked at him steady in a way that made the joke curdle in his stomach before she even spoke. Only if you ask me, she said. Quiet, plain, no joke in it at all. And then she turned and walked out the back of the forge, leaving him standing there in the sudden silence, with the full weight of what she'd just said, settling slow over him like a fresh snowfall. He didn't sleep well that night, or the 2 nights after. He came to his senses on a Thursday, 4 days later, having spent every one of those 4 days rehearsing and discarding a dozen different things he might say to her. He found her at the forge, same as always, working a piece of iron that didn't strictly need working, which told him plainly enough that she'd been rehearsing something of her own. I've been a coward 4 days running, he said. No preamble, the words coming out rougher than he'd planned. Standing in that doorway thinking of 100 clever ways to say what I mean, when the truth is, I don't need clever. I need honest, and I've been short on that since Eleanor passed. Maggie set down her hammer, saying nothing, waiting. I've known you 10 years, Daniel said. Watched you shoe 1,000 horses, raise yourself up running this forge alone after your father passed. Teach my daughter a trade half this town thinks isn't fit for a woman, and never once ask permission from anybody to be exactly who you are. I gave you a joke, 4 days back, because a joke felt safer than the truth. The truth is, I've been half in love with you for longer than I've had the courage to admit, and I'd count myself the luckiest man in Colorado territory. If you'd let me ask you plain, instead of hiding behind some fool joke about you never marrying. That an apology? That's an apology, and a question both, if you'll let it be. She was quiet a long moment, and Daniel's stomach had time to sink clean through the floorboards before she finally spoke. You gave a grieving man's daughter a place to learn a trade nobody else would teach her. You matched $11.40 for a sick old man without blinking. You put a hook in your wall so you could set down grief you'd been carrying too long without ever once asking me to explain why that mattered. I've watched you become a gentler man than the one who first walked into this forge with a loose shoe, Daniel Whitcomb, and I've been waiting the better part of 6 months for you to notice what I already knew. Ask me plain, and you'll have your answer. He asked her plain. She said yes before he'd even finished the question. Word of the engagement reached Maggie's aunt in Denver inside of 2 weeks, on account of her cousin passing through Larkin Creek and carrying gossip the way cousins do. Aunt Beatrice arrived by stage the following Sunday and made her opinion known before she'd properly unpacked. There's a Mr. Reginald Pierce in Denver, Beatrice said. Over a supper Maggie hadn't particularly wanted to cook for her. Owns 2 dry goods stores outright. Asked after you not 4 months back, when you visited for your cousin's wedding. I don't recall a Mr. Pierce. You danced with him twice. He remembers you fondly. I remember dancing with several men that evening, Aunt Beatrice, and none of their faces stuck with me the way this conversation is threatening to. This is serious, Margaret. A blacksmith's forge is a hard, dirty trade for a woman to keep once she's married, and a rancher with debts on his herd isn't the security a woman your age ought to be settling for. Mr. Pierce could offer you a proper house, servants, a life free of soot under your fingernails. Maggie set down her fork, calm as anything, though Daniel, seated across the table, having been invited specifically so Beatrice could look him over and find him wanting, could see the effort it cost her to keep her voice level. Aunt Beatrice, do you know what Daniel did the week Ezekiel Barnes fell ill? I couldn't say. He matched every dollar I raised for the man's doctor bills, out of his own pocket, without once asking to be thanked for it. Do you know what he did for a leaking roof over my forge I'd been too proud to fix myself? Margaret, I don't see what this. He fixed it. without asking permission, because he'd rather meddle kindly than watch me struggle alone out of pride. And do you know what he gave me for Christmas, Aunt Beatrice? Not jewelry, not ribbon. A plain iron hook, forged with his own hands after watching me teach him the trade for a week straight, so he'd have somewhere to set down a grief he'd been carrying 5 years too long. That's not the gesture of a man offering security, Aunt Beatrice. That's a man who paid attention to exactly what I needed, long before I ever had the courage to ask for it plain. Mr. Pierce remembers 2 dances at a wedding. Daniel Whitcomb knows precisely how I take my coffee, and that I hum old church hymns when I'm nervous working iron, and that I'd rather have soot under my fingernails doing honest work than sit idle in some fine parlor in Denver. I know exactly which life I'm choosing, and I'd choose it again every single time you asked. Beatrice sat with that a long moment, fork untouched. You always were a stubborn girl, she said finally, though something in her voice had softened considerable. Learned it honest. Aunt Beatrice. Same place I learned everything else. Beatrice left on the Tuesday stage. She sent, 3 weeks later, a fine set of forging tools as a wedding gift. Tools far finer than anything Maggie's own forge currently held, which Maggie understood to be the closest thing to a blessing the woman had left in her to give. I chose this, Maggie told Daniel that evening, once her aunt's dust had settled on the road out of town. Wanted you to know it was a real choice, and not the only road on offer. I looked hard at the easier path, same as you asked me to consider, and I picked the harder one anyway, and I'd pick it again every single time. Why? Daniel asked, though he thought he already knew the answer plain enough by then. Because of a roof fixed without permission. Because of $11.40 matched without complaint. Because of a small iron hook that told me you'd noticed exactly what I needed before I ever found the courage to ask. You never gave me one grand gesture in all our 10 years knowing each other, Daniel. You gave me 100 small true ones instead. And I'll take that over every fine house in Denver. Every time. $11.40, he said, half a laugh caught in his throat. And a rooftop I fixed without asking. That's a strange proposal to look back on. It's the truest one I've ever heard, she said. That's what makes it worth remembering. They married that April, in the Larkin Creek forge itself, Maggie's own choice, on account of it being the place where the whole slow business had first begun to turn. Sarah stood at the front, holding the ring on a small velvet cushion Maggie herself had stitched, prouder than any 9-year-old had a right to be, having correctly guessed the whole matter, a full 2 months before either adult managed to say it plain. Ezekiel Barnes, fully recovered, gave a short toast, declaring Maggie Sullivan the finest blacksmith and the stubbornest woman Larkin Creek had ever produced, and nobody in attendance disputed either claim. Maggie wore a simple gray wool dress, practical enough to work in the following week if called upon, and Daniel wore his father's old good coat, the collar mended by Maggie's own steady hand 2 weeks prior, a small detail neither one mentioned aloud, though both noticed it, plain enough, every time the light caught the stitching, 6 years later. The Whitcomb household had settled into a rhythm neither Daniel nor Maggie could have predicted that first Tuesday morning with a loose horseshoe. Maggie still ran the forge 3 days a week, now training Sarah properly, alongside 2 other girls from town, whose fathers had finally come round to the notion that iron work suited capable hands, regardless of what they wore to church on Sunday. Daniel's herd had grown past 600 head, and the 2 of them had added a boy of 4 to their household, a stubborn little thing who'd already taken to following his mother into the forge every chance he got. Much to Daniel's amused despair, Sarah, 15 now, had all but taken over teaching the newest apprentices herself, patient in exactly the way Maggie had once been patient with her. One evening that spring, Daniel found Maggie standing at the forge doorway after closing, looking at the small iron hook still hanging just inside their bedroom door down the road at the house, visible through the connecting path between forge and home. "You still think about that hook?" he asked, coming up beside her. "Every so often. Best gift I ever gave, though I didn't know it at the time. Best gift I ever got." Didn't know that either, standing there confused as anything, wondering why you were handing me a piece of iron for Christmas. You always were slow to notice the important things, Daniel Whitcomb. 10 years slow by my count. Good thing you were patient. Wasn't patience, she said, leaning into his shoulder the way she had 1,000 evenings since. Was just waiting for you to catch up to what I already knew. Same as teaching ironwork, really. Can't rush a man into understanding something. Just got to keep the fire steady till he's ready to shape himself around it. They stood there together a while longer, the forge cooling behind them, their children's voices carrying faint from the house down the path, the small iron hook holding its quiet place inside a door that had, 6 years running now, never once needed to be shut against either one of them. Their son came running down the path just then, 4 years old and covered in soot. He had no business being covered in, declaring proudly that he'd helped Sarah make a real horseshoe that very afternoon, though the shoe in question was bent nearly in half and fit for nothing but a keepsake shelf. That's a fine first shoe, Maggie said, crouching to examine it with the same careful seriousness she gave every piece of iron that crossed her anvil, grown or small. Papa says I'll be as good as you someday. Your papa says a great many things, Maggie said, glancing up at Daniel with the same dry look she'd given him that first Tuesday morning 10 years back. But that one, I believe, he might actually be right about. Daniel laughed and lifted his son onto his shoulders, and the four of them walked the short path home together in the fading spring light, past a forge that had once been a lonely woman's whole world, and had become, slow and sure over 6 good years, simply one warm room among several in a house full of people who belonged to each other. Now, friends, if you've stayed with me this whole way through, I thank you for it truly. Here's the plain lesson I've carried away from Daniel and Maggie's story. Sometimes the truest things we feel get said sideways first, a joke, a tease, a careless comment we don't think all the way through, before we ever find the courage to say them straight. And sometimes it takes someone brave enough to answer that sideways joke with a straight truth to show us what we'd been circling around all along. If you've been hiding something true behind a joke, or waiting on somebody to catch up to what you already know in your own heart, I hope this story gives you the courage to say the plain first, instead of waiting on someone else to say it for you. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. Until next time, keep listening.